And the first time I saw him, I was delivering my papers on my paper route. And I finished my paper route and I stopped by this liquor store to read cycle news. And I opened it up and I got to see this picture of Jim Fishback and Larry Rossler. I think they were like 250 champions in the desert. And they were just really star riders. And Jim Fishback and Larry Rossler always intrigued me. These guys were gifted riders. And I thought, this is cool. These guys are awesome because I always kind of dream of racing the desert. And these guys were desert racers. So it was pretty cool that, I got to read about these guys. And then I found out that Jim Fishback wasn't really happy with racing with the desert because he's kind of a showman and he doesn't crash very much because he's an excellent rider, but he's a big gnarly dude and he rides pretty wild. So once in a blue moon, he'll crash. And then he said that in an interview that he didn't really like crashing and then having only snakes and tortoises watching him. He liked people watching him. So Jim later switched to motocross because there was a few more people at the motocross, and he raced at Carlsbad and other tracks. And Jim Fishback's a good rider no matter what he rides. He knows how to twist that throttle. And he had moderate success as a motocross racer, just a big dude. But maybe that wasn't enough for Jim. So he went ahead and I guess he went to a speedway race, probably Costa Mesa. And he saw like how cool speedway really is. And he went ahead and saw that there's lots of people going to like Costa Mesa. Now, Jim Fishback, when he crashes, he doesn't have to crash in front of tortoises and snakes, but he can crash in front of 6,500 screaming fans, getting a bird's eye view on the crash and the victory also. Because he was a hardcore racer. He started in about 75 and he just went straight into speedway, was practically like a Division I rider. And for those of you that do not know what a Division I rider is, it's the top division rider. So they have 3 different levels of riders: the beginners, the intermediate, and the top professionals. And Fishback quickly went up to top professional. Why? Because he was a good motorcycle rider. He could ride anything. So the speedway bike probably wasn't like that big of a deal to him because he was such a gifted racer. So he went ahead and picked up speedway really fast. And he was just a big dude. He was huge because, speedway riders are mostly small. They're tiny, light, fast guys. But Fishback, he kind of broke the mold. He was just a large, big, gnarly dude. He was bigger than any speedway rider around. And he was heavy. And he was just a wild guy. And his riding was wild. He was probably the second most wild big guy on speedway at the time. Probably the one of the most gifted big guys was Danny Berserko Becker, because he could like ride wheelies on the wall. He was just really crazy, really wild speedway rider. However, Fishback, with less experience, was almost equally as wild as Becker. And although Danny Becker was probably a more gifted rider, Fishback was definitely a wild rider, almost the same as Becker. So these guys were fun to watch because they gave the fans a show. And Jim Fishback and Danny Becker were definitely showmen in their times. But back in 75, Fishback was a first-year rider. And he didn't really, know much about speedway, really. But he was good. He was very fantastic for being just a raw rookie. And he went ahead and had a lot of success that year. So much success that he was the rookie of the year in Division I. So that's quite the honor to just come into Speedway and be the rookie of the year. So that tells you that Jim Fishback was quite the star racer. And not only did he get the rookie of the year, but he qualified for the first year national championship in the Speedway. That year they had a special national championship. It was at this long track at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. And I happened to go to that race. And it was cool because Harry Oxley, I think Ivan Majors, Barry Briggs, these guys, they all joined together, Jack Milne, and they put together this really great track. It was like a long track from like Europe. And it was fast, a lot faster than Costa Mesa or Irwindale. But it was a really awesome track. And Jim Fishback, he competed in that particular event. And that happened to be my first year racing. I started at the end of the season, but I went there with my Bell helmet jacket. I was very happy to be a Speedway racer at the Nationals, very proud. And I got these tickets. They were like the fourth row up from the crash wall. That was in turn 1 and 2 from the starting gate. And they were really cool seats. They were right down low, right on the action. I really enjoyed it. And Fishback, he had quite the night, really, for being just a first-year rookie, a racer. And probably the most memorable race that he was in that night was Event 12. And that was with Wild Bill Cody, Rick Woods, and it was supposed to be Mike Caruso, but he was the no-show that year. So it was Steve Nutter. He took the place of Mike Caruso. Steve Nutter, that particular event, he did fantastic because he was the first reserve, and he finished on the podium at the end of the night in 3rd place. So that was pretty amazing, to not even be on the program and then at the end of the night be on the podium. You don't hear that very often, but Steve Nutter was a fantastic rider, and he definitely earned that. So he gained a lot of respect from me, from being a reserve rider to the podium the same night. That was incredible. But on race 12, also Jim Fishback raced Rick Woods. So it was Cody, it was Nutter, it was Woods, and it was himself, Fishback. And it was heat 12. And they went into the first turn. I remember that very clear. And Rick Woods and Jim Fishback, they locked handlebars. They were going, for the pole, going for the win. And they locked handlebars, and they got a little out of control. And they were kind of going really fast because it was a fast track. And what happened was Fishback kind of lost control of the bike because none of those riders, Woods and Fishback, were backing off. They were both really riding heavy. So Fishback just comes straight at me. I was right at the turn 1 and 2, and Fishback on the first turn, he came right at turn 1 and 2, right at me. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he was going fast, right? It was a fast track. So I'm just freaking out. And then Fishback, he just goes straight into the wall because he just like careened from Woods and bounced like right into the wall. And I'm like freaking out because I was only 4 rows above the ground. And then Fishback goes flying over the wall right at me. And I'm like, holy shit, big dude. Fishback was, they called him the animal because he was really an animal. And he just goes flying like ass over tea kettle over the wall. And I'm freaking out. I couldn't believe that. And so Fishback, he flies and lands 1 row in front of me, 1 row. And he smashes this little old lady. She's like 80 years old. She's an old lady. She was just sitting there probably with her granddaughters and her daughter. And Fishback just nails this old lady. And I'm like, oh my God. And this lady just screams. She lets out this ear-piercing scream, this 80-year-old lady. And I'm just like, holy shit. And this lady's screaming, my leg is broken. And Fishback just smashed this lady. Of course, the momentum of going full speed, flying over the wall, smashing into this little old brittle lady, 80 years old. It's gotta hurt that old lady. And I'm glad he didn't hit me. But I probably could have absorbed the punch better than that 80-year-old lady, I'm sure. But the lady was screaming and she had broke both of her legs. And Fishback was laying right in front of me. And I looked down at Fishback and he's just like shaking his head like, I don't believe this. And I'm like, oh, geez. And then Fishback, just only like 2 feet in front of my face, he puts his head towards this lady who's screaming, who has 2 broken legs, probably internal injuries as well. And he says, sorry, lady. Sorry, lady. And I thought, what the hell? And Fishback gets up and he jumps over the wall. And this lady's screaming and the paramedics are coming, and all these ambulance people and stuff. They have the car. They're carrying this lady away. She can't walk. She's got broken legs and who knows what else happened to this poor old lady. So Fishback jumps over the wall. I'm watching this thing, bird's eye view, close by. And Fishback's bike hit the wall straight on. And it was destroyed. I mean, the wheel was all destroyed. The frame was all bent. They couldn't walk the bike back to the pits. And it was far. The pits was all the way clear on the other side of the track. So it was a long distance. And the pit guy had to do like a wheelie on Fishback's bike. And then he had to roll that bike all the way back to the pits. But thank goodness that Fishback had a backup bike, because they gave him like the 2-minute warning after the crash. And Fishback was able to go to his reserve bike, warm it up, and get back on the track for heat number 12. So that was pretty cool. And Fishback, he finished 3rd place in that particular heat, which was pretty good for flying over the wall and destroying his bike. I thought that was rather amazing. And at the end of the night, I think Fishback either got 6 or 7 points. I have one program. I scored. I was the scorekeeper. And I was only like a young 16-year-old first-year rider. So I probably made some mistakes in the program. But I have some programs. I have a couple of programs I had saved on my computer. And one program says Fishback got 6 points that night. And the other program says he got 7 points. I scratched it out. So I think there was some kind of dispute. So if he got 7 points that night, he did really well, because Bruce Penhall was a first-year rider that year, and he got 7 points. So he tied another first-year rider who got into the Nationals I'm talking about. And also it was Boogaloo Bobby's first year in the Nationals. That was his first trip along with Penhall to the United States Speedway Nationals. And Bobby Schwartz got like 6 points that event. And so Fishback did really well, considering he flew over the wall. He smashed a lady up, put her in the hospital, probably killed the poor old lady. And he did really well. And then he got back on the track, got 3rd place that same race. And then he went ahead and he beat like Jeff Sexton in points that night. He beat Mark Cherry. He beat, let's see, who else? Scott Sivage. And he beat a couple more riders, Rick Woods. So for a first-year rider, just kind of qualifying for the Nationals, Jim Fishback, did a phenomenal job as far as I was concerned. But that crash, that old lady screaming, my leg, I'll never forget that. And lots of people remember that, by the way. I remember it because it happened like right in my face. So that was quite the experience that happened. And so he was really, really good racer. And I knew like Fishback was the kind of guy that I knew I didn't really want to race. I'm like, this guy's tough as nails. He's a big dude, gnarly guy. And he's kind of like insensitive, he's just like a tough dude. And he just didn't seem to be very sweet, and that's what it takes to be a good racer, right? So, I got to give the guy a lot of credit too. But he's a tough dude. And then Fishback just, he had really some great races. He was kind of a little bit out of control rider. The guy was a little wild. Like that's why I was saying kind of like a Danny Becker, because he was really wild, but Danny was probably more wild. But he was just out of control. But he rode really fast in his prime. And Jim Fishback rode a total of like about 10 years. He rode into the 80s, and he was still pretty good. I mean, Fishback, didn't lose a lot from his early days. Although all riders, when they get older, they slow down a little bit, right? And Fishback was no different than every rider. But he was just a gifted rider. And he was really good. So good that in 76, they chose him to be a member of the San Bernardino Sizzler team. Do you remember the San Bernardino Sizzler Speedway team of the National Speedway League? The last place, or second to the last place. They were kind of on the bottom, the Sizzlers. Like they were in like next to the bottom sometimes, and then at the bottom, and next. I'm not exactly sure where they ended up. I heard that the Orange County Eagles, they ended up at the bottom. So the Sizzlers ended up in like third or fourth place. I think there's 5 teams. They ended up in like fourth place, below Ventura and below the Los Angeles Sprockets at Irwindale. And the first place team was the Bakersfield Bandits. But they were a pretty good team. And they had like Lightning Larry Shaw, and then they had Mark Cherry. They had a young, Ron Preston. And they had like Mark Churf, I think, was on that team. And then they had a bunch of injuries and stuff. So they got all these new riders. And they got Brad Oxley as a replacement rider. And then they got a young Brad Oxley and a young Dennis Sigalos. Siggy was in the house. And he was telling me about the story when he was racing for the Sizzlers, how he slid on the wall, chest first, because in San Bernardino, where they had the home team for the Sizzlers, the wall wasn't very high because he had so much dirt at the San Bernardino Speedway. And Dennis was telling me on a live stream that one day I guess he crashed into the wall. Dennis was kind of an outside rider. He was a great rider, young, developing, but there's definitely some stardom, coming up in Sigalos' ability as a racer. But this one race, Dennis, he flew down and hit this wall, and he skidded on the wall, the crash wall, because it wasn't very high because of all the dirt on the track. And then Dennis got up the wall, and then he looked at his uniform, and he had a splinter from the crash wall. It was all wood. And the splinter went right to like his body, but it didn't pierce his body. So that was kind of a crazy story. And he's like, I had this huge splinter, and it was like near his heart. So it's a good thing that this splinter didn't pierce his body. Thank goodness for those leathers. But anyways, getting back to Fishback, he was a good rider. I think Larry Shaw was the captain of that team. But Fishback was like a co-captain or a leader in some way of that team. They had a good team. And I remember Dennis telling me that he used to always go to Fishback, and like Fishback would protect him. I guess maybe he rode with Jim in some of the races, and Fishback would always kind of give him advice as a young rider, as Dennis Sigalos said. And Fishback was just a really, good rider. I mean, we're talking about a year 2 rider, and Fishback was already like a seasoned veteran. So this guy could definitely ride Speedway. He was a good rider, and he definitely, knew how to ride. But San Bernardino Sizzlers, I asked Dennis if they got like free, like Sizzlers, like steaks and salad bars and stuff. And he said, no, we didn't get nothing. And I thought that was really cheap for a team being sponsored by the Sizzler Steakhouse, not to even get like a free meal. That sucks, right? That sucks. But that's the way life is. So Jim went ahead and he just had a very successful career. Definitely could ride the bike. I remember one time when I first moved into Division I, I had Jim Fishback on one of my races, and all I can remember is him crashing into that little old lady, busting her leg, and being just a mean, gnarly dude. So I'm like, I was in the line ready to go out to the races at Costa Mesa, and there was two lines of Division I riders, and I was on the front line, and Fishback was on the back line behind me. And I said to myself, "Oh, I got Fishback in this race. Very good," because I really didn't like want to race this guy, not that much. And so, anyways, I looked around and I didn't see Fishback around, and I'm like, maybe he's not here. So I turned around and I looked behind me, and there was Fishback, and he was just looking at me, and he was snarling at me like, ah, ah. And I'm like, this guy's crazy, man. This guy's a nut. Can you imagine? Ah, ah. That guy's nuts. And I was only like 16 or so, and I'm like, dang, this guy's crazy. I'm not happy about it. And all I could think of is, Brian, I was a low yardage rider, and I said, you're the jackrabbit here. Don't let that guy get you. Just go fast. Blow this guy away. Don't even give this guy a chance to get near you. And I have that race on video. I do. I honestly do. I got to get like a recorder on like a laptop so I could record that race. I have it. I hope it's still, okay. But I just blew everybody away. I was scared shitless. And I just didn't let any of those guys catch me at all. And I just literally just lit that track on fire. And when the race was over, I was so far in front, nobody even was in the ballpark. And I'm like, that's because Fish outweighed me by like 3 times. So I did not want that guy anywhere near me. And he didn't get near me. But he was really a great rider. And he just had lots of success, as a speedway rider. And then as he retired, he still stayed in speedway. A lot of guys, when they retire, they get out of speedway. But Fishback, he stayed in speedway. And for a season or so, he became a referee of speedway. Now, can you imagine Jim Fishback, a referee, like going up to the riders and saying, "Oh yeah, you want to argue with me? I'm gonna kick your ass. I'm Jim Fishback." And Jim is a gnarly dude, and as a rider, you don't want to be screwing with this guy because he's a tough guy, and he's tougher than any speedway rider out there. Let me tell you. And so I'm sure he was a good referee because whatever Fishback said, that was like law. Because who's gonna mess with Fishback? Nobody. So anyways, he was a referee for a while, and then I guess he got out of it. And then he also things with Christian. Christian was winning a lot of money. So at least Fishback could pay for some of his equipment and tires and stuff. It wasn't a total loss for Jim. But he sponsored Alan Christian at the end. And as many of you know, Christian and Michael Bass, were arch enemies. There's lots of rivalries on the track. And, anytime you had that race with Alan Christian and Michael Bass, everybody was watching that race. There was nobody going to the restrooms, nobody going to the beer lines, nobody going anywhere except watching those two race because it was ferocious back in the 80s. And it was wild. Christian was coming up and Bass was already up, and these two guys knocked heads like crazy, and they were both just sensational racers, and they had this rivalry that was very, very powerful and strong, and everybody wanted to see these guys race. So Alan Christian was just an incredible rider, along with Michael Bass. And so Fishback sponsored Christian towards the end, and Christian kind of still racing as he got old and wanted to retire. Finally, he retired. And Fishback, was done. But that was a smart move, getting Christian to ride your bike, splitting the money, because I know he made some money. This guy won a lot of main events, and he won national championships, and he was a hot rider, Alan Crazy Christian. I rode against him a couple times, and he was a major pole rider, big dude, strong pole rider. I was a pole rider, but I wasn't strong like Christian. And I remember racing him. It was either, I can't remember, it was a main event or like a heat race. I don't even remember, but I just remember I had to gas it. I had to stay on the pole, and I had to run as fast as Christian was and don't let him touch me and get close. And he was running up to me, but he never was able to push me aside. That's his style. But I wasn't able to get pushed around because he quite didn't catch me. I was just a hair bit the same speed, so he couldn't really nudge me out. But he was a scary dude because he was fast, Alan Crazy Christian, and he was no joke. So anyways, he went ahead and sponsored Christian, for a few years until Christian gave up the ghost. And then also back when IMS disbanded, they went ahead and started this track back like in the 90s, maybe late 80s or 90s, called Glen Helen. I think it was Wednesday night. I'm not sure. It took the place of IMS in San Bernardino. Glen Helen is, Glen Helen. And they had a cool track. It's a very long track. And it was a fast track also. And I think Fishback was kind of getting retired at the time. He was finished racing mostly. Maybe he rode, but he was like a rider's representative for the promoter. So the promoter hired Jim Fishback to kind of oversee the riders and to kind of solve any problems that the riders may have and stuff like that. So Jim Fishback took on more of this kind of managerial role. In that track, I raced that track too. It was fast and it was kind of a fun track, but it was a hard track for me because it's fast, and I was just coming back from several years left. So it took me some time to get back in gear and race that long track. But that was Glen Helen and near San Bernardino. And then Fishback, he ended up coaching his son, little Jimmy Fishback, and he was a junior spear rider. I think he might have won a national championship as a junior from what I vaguely remember. And Jimmy had a lot of qualities of his dad. And he was a good rider, Jimmy Fishback. And he was just a little guy. And his dad taught really good racing blood in him. And Jim went ahead and tutored his son. And I think after a while, his son got out of Speedway, Jimmy. And he stayed out of Speedway for quite some time. And then as he got older, maybe into his 20s, middle 20s or something, Jimmy Fishback, the little animal, came back into Speedway. And he started racing once again. And of course, Papa was by his side. And I remember Jim and Jimmy all the time coming to the races. And I became good friends with Little Animal and got a chance to talk with him a lot and stuff. And he turned out to be quite the Division I rider. He was really coming on strong, and he really had some good main event wins, especially at the Industry. But he raced all the tracks, Costa Mesa. He had, when little Jimmy Fishback, the little animal, gave everyone a run for their money for sure. He wasn't a national champion like his papa was a national champion. These guys were good racers, and they were tough. And little Jimmy was kind of a smaller guy. He wasn't as tall as his papa. His papa was just a big, gnarly dude. And little Jimmy was not so big and gnarly. He was just a smaller guy. Must have had a small mom. I don't know. But he was a tough guy anyways. Even though he's little, you can't underestimate small guys. I remember Jim Fishback telling me the story that that little Jimmy they transferred high schools, I guess it was. And it was out towards Rialto or Fontana or something like that. Little Jimmy was going to school, and he didn't really fit in because there was a lot of minorities going to the schools, blacks, Mexicans, a lot of gangster kind of guys. It was a rough area, a rough school. And here's this little white kid. He doesn't look very strong, but he went to the school, and that was little Jimmy. He was a tough dude, though, so looks are deceiving. And so his dad was telling me, Jim was telling me that he went to school, like one of his first days at this high school, this new school, and this big black guy, they were like laughing at Jimmy and little Jimmy. And Jimmy just told the guy, just shut the hell up, like told him to fuck off or whatever. And then the black guy is like, what did you say to me, little boy, little white boy? And little Jimmy just said, dude, like, don't screw with me. You're going to regret it. And the guy's like, oh, really? A little white guy is going to beat me up. And Jimmy's like, yeah, probably. So the black guy jumps little Jimmy at school, high school, it's the first day at school. The black guy had like 50 friends, all gangster dudes. And little Jimmy just beat the shit out of this big old gangster dude. He just beat the hell out of this guy. And everyone's like, OMG. Little Jimmy got a lot of respect after he beat the snot out of this big gangster dude. And so little Jimmy didn't have too much problem after that. Nobody hassled him. Nobody made fun of little Jimmy. And with little Jimmy. I remember one time we had a situation at Costa Mesa. I had a teammate, Fast Eddie Cash, and it was a fair derby, and it was just, I don't want to get into it too much, but there was a situation that he got kicked out by the referee for rolling the start, and it was kind of questionable maybe, and it turned into this big ruckus, and the referee left his box, and Eddie was flipping off the referee, and there was all these fair officials from like the state of California, these like top people of the fair board and everything. So it was a packed fair derby with like 8,000 or 9,000 people there. It was packed. I was racing that night also. And Eddie was really mad because he kind of screwed his night up and made him like leave. That was just, he got kicked out going towards the main event. And so Eddie flipped this referee off, who we since have made up with. And, we don't have bad blood no more, but we had bad blood back then. And the referee left the box, his referee box, came out to the pit gate almost area on the track. And Eddie, my rider, Eddie, and the referee start fighting. They start duking. I've never seen a referee leave the box, come out to the racetrack, start fighting a racer. That was like unheard of until that day. So anyways, this fight was going on and I was freaking out. I couldn't believe it. And then the first person to jump in the fight and break it up and to bring law and order to the situation was little Jimmy Fishback. He was, anytime there was a fight or a ruckus, you see little Jimmy just like an animal, just get in there and fix things and stop it. He was quite the character. But getting back to the Papa, he was just really supportive. Jim Fishback was supportive of his son, and he just was really, a good father and stuff like that. And he really, was supportive. And Jim Fishback kind of didn't like me that much. I think since I was 16 years old, and I would talk to him, and he would kind of give me like, I think we're friends now, but for a long time he didn't respect me or like me and stuff. And I became kind of a top level D2 rider. I went to D1 and I didn't do that well in D1 at the Grand, but I stayed down in D2 and won like lots of championships. And I was a top rider in Division 2, which is the intermediate class. And I had great success in the middle class. And I was trying to like talk to Jim Fishback a few times, and he kind of wasn't really a top rider at the time. I was getting old. And so I told Jim Fishback, like, dude, I'd like to race you, like I'd like to take you on. And Jim, he saw that I was doing well as a racer. I was kind of like practiced, I was racing the circuit at the time. So I was in full speedway shape at the time. And Jim never really responded to me, but I wanted so bad to race him and just blow him away, because I knew, I had a little bit on him at the time. I would not challenge somebody if I didn't think I could beat him, right? But there was another incident that a guy who wasn't that good of a racer, I forgot his name. I saw this video on YouTube. You could probably find it. And if I wasn't doing a live stream, I would have showed this video. But this guy, he was kind of probably like a intermediate D2 rider. Probably wasn't that great. Probably wasn't that bad. He wasn't that bad. He was okay. He started making rude comments to Jim Fishback, and Jim Fishback told him to shut his mouth. And they became like it was like an internet fight between Fishback and this guy. I don't even know. I forgot his name. I didn't really pay. He's like somebody we don't really talk about. So, you know, he's not like a no-name guy. But anyways, Fishback and him kind of got into it. And this guy told him, he said, you know, I'm going to match race you. And if we race, the only thing you're going to see is the back of my jersey with my name and number to Jim Fishback. And Jim Fishback was an older guy at this time. He wasn't in his prime. He was kind of an old guy. He weighed like 300 pounds or something, big old belly and everything, big old guy. But Fishback still had ability to race, you know, even as an old dude. And so Fishback took this guy off and offer up to race him. And they had a match race, and it's on YouTube. It's pretty funny. And you can see Bruce Flanders talking about Fishback's weight and, you know, how he looks so big. And Fishback wore this big old motocross jersey like what I'm wearing. And he went out, and the guy was kind of beating Fishback a little bit. But at the end, at the finish line, Fishback just snaked the guy, and he passed him right at the checkered flag. And then Fishback's like showing like his back of his jersey to the guy, like, here's my name, Fishback. It was so funny. And I'm thinking, guy, you know, even as an big old dude, Jim Fishback still had the ability to race, you know, even though he was out of shape, he was old, and he was very heavy set. He still had that racing ability. So Fishback, you know, us speedway riders, even though we're not the same as maybe we were when we were kids, we still were racers, right? Like Jim Fishback. And you just have that ability to be, you know, a racer. So Fishback never lost that. And he got into lots of different kinds of racing in his career. And, you know, he just kind of was a hardcore dude and talented. You know, Jim Fishback was really good. And his son got into all forms of like car racing and stuff, and off-road racing and boat racing. And they did all this kind of stuff, just a racing family. But Fishback was an incredible rider. He really was one of those one-of-a-kind guys from the 70s. Like, you can't forget that guy. And he just was a classic. And, you know, he was a really talented racer. You know, the guy was scary too. And one thing you didn't want to do if you're a rider back in the day, you didn't want to fight Jim Fishback, because Fishback would really take you out. And he could sit on you and take you out. And the guy was gnarly. He had these big arms, and he just was grizzly dude. And he was really scary. You know, the guy was really tough. But he was a lot of fun, though, to watch, because he was a character, you know, kind of like a bad guy. But he wasn't really bad. I think he just kind of put on a show a little bit, too. But he was really cool. And Jim Fishback was a talented rider, along with his son, Jimmy. They're both talented, father and son. But it was good days back in the day. And I always remember the time when Fishback smashed that little old lady from Pasadena. I don't know where she was from. Maybe it was from somewhere else. And I just could not believe this guy. He was just so radical and so cool. And I had to race this guy. And it wasn't always really exciting to have to race the guy who you knew if he caught you, he would probably take you out. So he was a tough guy, but he was a lot of fun too. So thank you so much for hanging out, listening to the Jim Fishback story. And I think he was one of the first riders to keep his 3-digit number. His number was like 275. And Jim Fishback, he kept that number through his whole racing career. A lot of the first division riders, they changed to like 2-digit numbers or 1-digit number, which is okay. But Fishback didn't care. He just kept that old first-time speedway number from back in 75. And he stayed with 275 his whole career. So that was pretty cool. And there's a few riders today that go ahead and, you know, keep those 3-digit numbers that are Division I riders. But yeah, so thanks again for watching the Jim Fishback story. There's probably a lot more to the story, but that's the best we can do in another half hour. But it just was good times. Fishback was a star rider. He never won a national championship, but he was really a hot rider. But thanks again. Subscribe, like this show if you liked it. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. And we're going to see you. Oh, of course. We're going to see you next time. Thank you so much. Take care.